Welcome to Audiobook 365 Stories.
For a long time, Jacques Baudelaire promised that he would never get married. But then he suddenly changed his mind. This happened one summer at the beach. One morning, Jacques was lying on the sand, watching the women come out of the water. He noticed a small, pretty foot. He looked up and liked the whole person, even though he could only see her ankles and head. The rest of her was covered by a bathrobe that she held closed. People said Jacques liked pleasure and had lived a wild life. So at first, he was attracted by the woman's beautiful body. But then, he liked her even more because she had a kind heart and a simple, sweet mind. Her cheeks and lips were as fresh as a flower. Jacques met her family and they liked him. He fell in love with her right away. When he saw Berthe Lannis walking on the long, yellow sand, he felt excited all over. When he was close to her, he could not talk or think. His heart beat fast, and his ears buzzed. His mind was confused. Was this love? Jacques didn't know or understand, but he decided he wanted this girl to be his wife. Berthe's parents were unsure for a long time. They had heard Jacques had a bad reputation. People said he had an old girlfriend, someone he could never really forget. Also, for a long time, Jacques loved every woman who came close to him. But then Jacques changed. He stopped seeing the woman he had lived with for a long time. A friend took care of her and made sure she had money. Jacques paid for this, but he didn't want to hear anything about her. He acted like he didn't even know her name. She wrote him letters, but he never opened them. Every week, he saw her messy handwriting on the letters. Every week, he felt more and more angry at her. He would tear up the envelope and paper without reading even one line. He already knew the letters were full of complaints and blame. No one believed Jacques would stay faithful. So Berthe's parents waited until spring to give him permission to marry her. The wedding happened in Paris at the start of May. The couple chose not to take a normal honeymoon trip. After a small dance with their younger cousins, which would end before 11 o'clock so the day wasn't too tiring, they planned to spend the first night in Berthe's parents' home. The next morning, they would leave for the beach, the place where they first met and fell in love. Night had come, and the dance was still happening in the big living room. The two of them had gone to a small Japanese room decorated with bright silks. The room was softly lit by a large, colorful lantern hanging from the ceiling, shaped like a big egg. Fresh air came in through the open window and gently touched their faces, as the night was warm and peaceful, full of the sweet smell of spring. They were quiet, holding each other's hands and sometimes squeezing them tightly. She sat there with a dreamy look on her face, feeling a little confused by this big change in her life. But she was smiling, feeling emotional, almost ready to cry. She was also almost ready to faint from happiness, believing that her whole world had changed because of what had just happened to her. She felt nervous, not knowing why, and her whole body and heart were filled with a wonderful but strange feeling. He was looking at her with a fixed smile. He wanted to speak, but couldn't find any words to say. So he just sat there, showing his strong feelings by squeezing her hand. Sometimes he would softly say, "Berthe," and every time, she would look up at him with loving eyes. They would look at each other for a moment, and then her eyes, fascinated by his, would look away again. They didn't have any words to share. They were alone, but sometimes some of the dancers from the other room would glance at them quickly, as if they knew something secret and important was happening. A door opened, and a servant came in, carrying a letter on a tray. A messenger had just brought it. Jacques, shaking, took the letter. He was suddenly very afraid, filled with a strange, quick fear of something bad happening. He looked at the envelope for a long time. He didn't know the handwriting. He was too scared to open it, not wanting to read it. He wanted to put it in his pocket and tell himself, "I'll wait until tomorrow when I'm far away." But in one corner of the envelope, there were two big words underlined. Very urgent. These words made him even more scared. He said, "Please forgive me, my dear," and opened the letter. He read the paper, became very pale, and read it again, this time very slowly, as if he was reading each word one by one. When he looked up, his face showed how upset he was. He said slowly, "My dear, it's from my best friend, who has had a very big problem. He needs me right away, for something very serious. Will you forgive me if I leave for half an hour? I'll come back quickly." Shaking and confused, she said, "Go, my dear." She hadn't been his wife long enough to feel she could ask him questions or demand to know more. He left. She stayed alone, listening to the music and dancing in the room next to her. Jacques grabbed the first hat and coat he could find and ran downstairs, taking 3 steps at a time. When he got to the street, he stopped under the streetlight and reread the letter. This is what it said. Sir. A girl named Ravet, who was once your sweetheart, has just given birth to a child she says is yours. The mother is about to die and is asking for you. I am writing to ask if you can come and see her, as it seems this poor woman is in great pain and needs your help. Yours truly, Dr. Bonnard. When Jacques arrived at the sick room, the woman was already close to dying. At first, he didn't recognize her. The doctor and 2 nurses were taking care of her. On the floor, there were buckets full of ice and bloody cloths. The carpet was wet, and 2 candles were burning on a dresser. Behind the bed, in a small basket, the baby was crying, and every time the baby cried, the mother, suffering in pain, tried to move, shaking under her ice bandages. She was dying from the birth. Her life was slipping away, and even with the ice and the care, the bleeding didn't stop, bringing her closer to her final moments. She saw Jacques and tried to raise her arms, but they were too weak. She couldn't lift them, but tears rolled down her pale face. Jacques dropped to his knees next to the bed, took one of her hands, and kissed it desperately. Slowly, he moved closer to her thin face, which trembled when he touched her. One of the nurses held a candle, lighting them, while the doctor watched from the back of the room. Then, in a voice that seemed far away, she said, "I am going to die, dear. Promise me you will stay with me until the end. Oh, don't leave me now. Don't leave me in my last moments." Jacques kissed her face and hair, and through his tears, he whispered, "Don't worry. I will stay." She was so weak that she couldn't speak for several minutes. Then she continued, "The little one is yours. I swear to God and on my soul that I am telling the truth. I have never loved another man but you. Please promise to take care of the child." Jacques, filled with guilt and sadness, tried to hold her frail body in his arms. In a broken voice he said, "I promise you that I will take care of him and love him. He will stay with me forever." She tried to kiss Jacques, but she was too weak to lift her head. She offered her white lips, asking for a kiss. Jacques leaned in to give her the kiss she wanted so badly. When she felt a little calmer, she whispered, "Bring the baby here, and let me see that you love him." Jacques gently went to get the child. He placed the baby carefully on the bed between them, and the little one stopped crying. She whispered, "Don't move any more." So he stayed still. Jacques held her hand, which was cold with death, just as earlier he had held her hand when it trembled with love. From time to time he glanced at the clock. It showed midnight, then 1 o'clock, then 2. The doctor came back. The 2 nurses, after moving quietly around the room for a while, were now asleep on chairs. The baby was asleep, and the mother, with her eyes closed, looked like she was resting too. Suddenly, just as the pale morning light started to come in through the curtains, she stretched out her arms very quickly and strongly, almost knocking the baby to the floor. A strange noise came from her throat, and then she lay back on the bed, not moving. She was dead. The nurses jumped up and said, "It's over." Jacques looked once more at this woman he had loved so much. Then he looked at the clock, which showed 4 o'clock, and he ran out of the room, still in his evening clothes, forgetting his coat. He took the baby in his arms and left. After Jacques had left her alone, his young wife, Berthe, waited at first calmly in the little Japanese room. But when he didn't come back, she went to the living room trying to look calm, though she was very worried. When her mother saw her alone, she asked, "Where is your husband?" Berthe replied, "He's in his room. He'll be back soon." After an hour had passed, and people kept asking her questions, she finally told them about the letter, how upset Jacques had looked, and her fear that something bad had happened. They waited, but there was no news. The guests left, and only the closest family stayed. At midnight, the bride was put to bed, crying sadly. Her mother and 2 aunts sat around the bed, listening to her cry, silent and full of sorrow. Berthe's father went to the police to see if he could find out what had happened. At 5 o'clock, a small noise was heard in the hall. A door quietly opened and closed. Suddenly, a little cry, like the sound of a kitten, was heard in the quiet house. All the women jumped up, and Berthe ran ahead of them, pushing past her aunts while wrapped in her bathrobe. Jacques stood in the middle of the room, pale and out of breath, holding a baby in his arms. The four women looked at him, shocked, but Berthe, who had suddenly found courage, rushed forward with fear in her heart and cried, "What happened? What's wrong?" Jacques looked around wildly and said in a short voice, I have a child and the mother has just died." With his clumsy hands, he held out the crying baby. Without saying a word, Berthe took the baby, kissed it, and held it close. Then she looked up at him with tears in her eyes and asked, "Did you say the mother is dead?" Jacques answered, "Yes, just now in my arms. I ended things with her in the summer. I didn't know anything. The doctor called me." Then Berthe softly said, "Well, we will take care of the little one